Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, May 9th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Ohio. Yes, a state that we haven't talked about much since the 2024 election, but one that is worth discussing today as the Ohio Republican Party announces their endorsement of Vivek Ramaswamy to be the next governor of this state. Now, Ohio is not necessarily a battleground. Donald Trump won the state by roughly 11 points, I think, in the last election, 11 to 13. I think I'm completely missing the mark here. I think Iowa was 13, Ohio was 11. The point is that it's not so much a swing state as it was in years past. If you remember, at the beginning of this channel, I talked about Ohio in the context of the 2017-2018 election season when it was much more of a swing state. In 2016, it voted for Trump by roughly 8 points, but only 4 years prior, Obama had won the state by 3, and 4 years before then had won it by 5. And so Ohio wasn't out of reach necessarily for Democrats then. Today, it's far more out of reach as Republicans start to make advancements across the state. But there was a shining beacon of hope for Democrats in Ohio in 2024, and it wasn't on the presidential level. Again, Kamala Harris ended up losing the state by 11.2. The idea of hope and the idea that Democrats could do well actually came down to the Senate elections. When they looked at Ohio, they had an incumbent Democrat, Sherrod Brown, who had been a long-time elected senator, who had a very high approval rating at different periods of time throughout his time in the United States Senate, who had represented an old guard of the Democratic Party. In the day and age of Obama, even before then, Sherrod Brown was largely regarded as different than that of Kamala Harris, different than that of many of the other mainstream Democrats that the Republican Party tried to associate Sherrod Brown with. What we saw, though, is that Sherrod Brown outperformed Kamala Harris by roughly 7 percentage points, losing by 4 points is what I meant to say, losing to Bernie Moreno, who ended up running a campaign that wasn't necessarily the best for the GOP, but certainly met its moment and was able to defeat Sherrod Brown in a state where, again, the Democratic candidate was outpacing Kamala Harris by 7 points statewide. And under different circumstances, under the 2016 election, Sherrod Brown might have been able to do well. He was in a position where, not to say do well, do even better than he did. Assuming that 7-point difference holds true, if Kamala Harris had made a slight improvement of that of Hillary Clinton's loss margin in the state of 8.1%, even by just 1 or 2 points, Sherrod Brown would have been senator for 6 more years. But he lost, largely because at the top of the ticket there was a collapse, at least in Ohio, especially for the Democratic Party, and no one else on the statewide or even congressional level as a Democrat did as well as they were expecting. But now looking ahead to 2026, the reason we talk about Ohio isn't because of a Senate race, though there is one up in 2026. Jon Husted, the incumbent lieutenant governor, or former lieutenant governor, now incumbent senator from the state of Ohio, he's looking at an opportunity right now to say, I'm going to run in for re-election in 2026 for a full term, but Vivek Ramaswamy has now become the Republican Party's favorite candidate for governor in this state. And so although Jon Husted, who is largely inconsequential, much more straight, middle of the road, at least when it comes down to Republicans who can still win over the Trump voters, but also more moderate-leaning voters at least, Sherrod Brown doesn't seem to see much of an opening when it comes down to the Senate race. But when it comes down to the governor's race, it seems to be a different story. There's been a lot of articles talking about how Sherrod Brown is keeping Democrats on their toes, and that's exactly what he's doing. He has given zero indication publicly that he's doing anything besides considering what his next steps are going to be, which means, in theory, could Sherrod Brown run for governor? Chances are he could. Could Sherrod Brown decide that he all of a sudden wants to run for Senate? He very well could. But chances are he will go the most electable route. And what we know, too, is that when you are not able to outrun nationalized politics, resorting to statewide politics often does you justice. Think about this on the inverse. If you remember the 2024 Senate races, you'll know that we covered races beyond just Ohio. There were plenty of competitive races, and none to spare our conversations. Maryland was one of them. This is my home state. When I started this channel, I had a Republican governor in office. Governor Larry Hogan had been elected in 2014 and re-elected in 2018. He was popular, held one of the highest approval ratings of any of the Republicans nationwide, and he used that to win re-election by double digits in a state that Hillary Clinton had won by nearly 30 points. Then he decided he wanted to run for Senate. 2 years after leaving the governor's mansion, left in January of 2023, Larry Hogan decided that he wanted to embark on a nationalized race, and that was the Senate race in Maryland. And although Larry Hogan had outrun Obama by 30 points, had outrun Clinton by more than 30 points, it became very difficult to do so on the Senate level because of the implications of this Senate race. Sherrod Brown is a bit on the opposite end, where he was able to win in Ohio in the past, just as Larry Hogan had been able to win in Maryland in the past. But when it came down to a nationalized election, especially coinciding with a presidential race, Sherrod Brown couldn't win this race. But an off-cycle, rather midterm election, where it's a much more localized and state-contained race, is a perfect opportunity for Sherrod Brown to get back involved in politics in Ohio. And Republicans just gave him a very simpler pathway forward. The 2026 governor election in Ohio was meant to be more competitive than it actually was, at least on the Republican side. Vivek Ramaswamy largely cleared the field, but there were many of the other candidates that decided that they wanted to run in this race. What we saw was that those who had even entered into the race, you had Matt Meyer, former director of the Buckeye Institute, but more notably, a Republican state treasurer who had been elected statewide who had already announced that he wanted to run in the Republican race. But Donald Trump endorsed Vivek Ramaswamy. Elon Musk did as well, and as did many members of the Trump coalition in Ohio, enough so that the Ohio GOP decided to put their entire weight and backing to prevent a competitive primary against Vivek Ramaswamy. That is what he tried to do, and that is what is happening in Ohio. But what we know about Vivek Ramaswamy, who has never run in an election before, is that he actually, arguably, is less electable than many of the other Republicans who could go for this race. There are U.S. representatives who could go for this race. There's the lieutenant governor who could go for this race. The Ohio state treasurer wanted to go for this race. There are plenty of people who could have said and said, you know what, I want to run for Ohio governor. And what we saw, Vivek Ramaswamy entering into this race, actually might be the kryptonite that Republicans will bring onto themselves, similar to that we've seen in previous governor elections in much more Republican states, is doing just enough. With the perfect combination of a strong Democrat and a bad Republican, you can lose almost any race. Let's take a look back at the last time the governor race in Ohio was competitive, because it wasn't 2022. Mike DeWine was exceptionally popular, very highly regarded, won his re-election by 25 points. Democrats didn't even invest a single dollar into the race. But 2018, it was competitive, and there's no doubt about that. We covered this race, and I remember doing a huge autopsy and a huge look at Ohio about what went right for Republicans, what went wrong for Democrats. But really, it was an improvement for Democrats. Hillary Clinton had lost the state by 8 points. They hadn't been able to hold the governorship in quite some time, and Richard Cordray came within 3.7% of defeating Mike DeWine in this state. And the reason why that was notable is only because Mike DeWine was a nobody. He was Attorney General of Ohio, and he also served in the United States Senate and had been elected statewide in Ohio. He had an electoral notability factor. But when it came down to the fact that Democrats were running someone who had been not too notable across the state, but had the institutional backing and the energy and enthusiasm of Democrats on their side, just because it was 2018, Ohio narrowed down significantly. But Mike DeWine and Vivek Ramaswamy are very different candidates. Again, Vivek has no electoral history, not one, at least in my opinion, that matters enough that it would have said that he is electable in Ohio. Do I think, all else taken aside, if it's not Sherrod Brown for governor, that Republicans with Vivek are going to win this race? Sure, I'd sign on to that. But with Sherrod Brown in the race, I think we start to see the brewing of a perfect set of circumstances to elect a Democrat in a state Trump won by 11 points. I would also take you to the 2018 map to look at some other states too, where very similar circumstances arose and let Democrats do very well in states they otherwise might not be able and might not have done really well in. In the 2016 election, South Dakota voted for Donald Trump by over 30 points. But Kristi Noem was running against Billy Sutton. Billy Sutton, who had seemingly come out of nowhere, brought this race within 3.4%. Kristi Noem, for all that she is in the cabinet today, was not a great candidate in South Dakota. She has been a consistent underperformer, and that has really been the main legacy of her time in Republican politics. She won by 3.4 in a state, again, Trump won by 30. But looking down, further down this middle of America portion, you can see that Kansas is a state that Laura Kelly won against the incumbent Attorney General, Chris Kobach, by 5 points. Now, Laura Kelly wasn't this candidate that, again, came with all this institutional backing. She was a strong Democrat who came in at the right time with a very weak Republican, who is largely seen as too extreme. So Laura Kelly defeated him by roughly 5 points. This gives Democrats some hope about what they might be able to do with Vivek Ramaswamy at the top of the ticket. Not a tried or tested incumbent or candidate in any regard. Sherrod Brown, on the other hand, as much as he did lose by 4 points, he outpaced Harris by 7, which means if the electorate is that of a Harris plus 3 electorate nationwide, meaning that those who vote in the midterms would have elected Kamala Harris by 3 points if that was the same electorate in 2024. It's just the necessary margin enough to boost Sherrod Brown to the governor's mansion in Ohio. And with Vivek Ramaswamy at the top of the ticket, arguably as the weakest Republican who can still win, let me include that caveat that he can still win, he just simply is not the strongest. With the perfect storm of Ramaswamy at the GOP ticket, Sherrod Brown on the Democratic ticket, Democrats actually do have a reason to think that Ohio might go their way. And while it does seem extreme and while it does seem very out there, 2018 really threw us for a loop, as did in many cases too 2022 after the Dobbs decision. And I think what we will find is that there will be some surprises, Ohio and others included. And if Sherrod Brown really enters into this race, as it very much seems like he is teetering between Senate and governor, heavily leaning towards governor, I would bet today that Sherrod Brown runs for governor and potentially wins the governorship. It will set up Democrats for a very real race in the state otherwise deemed unwinnable. And that in its own right is a victory for them, and that actual victory may come in a year and a half, but only if Sherrod Brown is at the top of the ticket, largely in thanks to the GOP, as Politico puts it, paving the way for Ramaswamy's gubernatorial bid. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.